the #1 long-form writer that helps SEOs outrank competition at the click of a button using real-time research and NLP. Start ranking content today with content@scale.ai.
Wix Studio, one end-to-end web creation platform for your agency to deliver exceptional work with absolute efficiency.
Morning, everyone. Mary's given most of the introduction there. I'm not going to spend too much time on myself because I've got quite a lot to get through. I've done too many slides. So we'll jump straight into things. What's on the agenda today? We're going to talk about what log files are. I assume that if you're in this track, you kind of got an idea as to what they are, but for anyone that's not familiar with them, I'll go through some basics. We'll talk about how to configure them, and then we'll talk about how to analyze them and get the most out of them once they're configured correctly. So, what are log files? As I said, a lot of people will be aware of what they are, but basically they contain detailed information about each request made to a server. Now that is whether that is a user, a bot, basically any user agent that requests something from a server that it gets logged. But before we jump into it, I've got one pro tip for everyone, and that's not to ask developers for logs because you'll get something like this. They're going to be really confused because there's more than one type of log. So the logs that we're talking about today are access logs. So you can get other things like error logs, for example, but server access logs are what we're going to talk about today. I've got a few examples as I run through. I am going to be talking about more of an Apache configuration because that tends to be the types of servers that we work with. There is obviously a lot of similarities with things like Nginx servers as well, but a lot of the configuration stuff I have is around Apache. So, configuration. Let's talk about the first couple of types of log files, or two broad types of log files. So we have common logs and combined logs, and I'm going to give you a bit of an idea as to what the difference is between the two of them and why combined logs are the ones that we should be shooting for as SEOs. So common log files, they contain some basic information. So they contain the IP address that a request was made from. They'll also contain the timestamp. They will also contain the file and the page that was requested, the HTTP request types, whether that is, for example, GET or POST or something similar, and the response code the file or page returned, as well as any bytes that were downloaded in the process. And that's kind of what a log would look like, or the response that you can see got the IP address, timestamp, and so on and so forth. So very, very basic amount of information. Not a lot that we can do with that, I guess, because again, it's fairly brief. So what we really want are combined logs, and they're not the default at all. So what we want is to add to the information that's in a common log, and this is kind of how you configure that in a combined log format. So they contain everything that the common logs contain as well, but they also contain things like user agent, time taken to process the request as well, which is obviously quite useful if you're looking at speed and response times of pages. The referrer, so where that event came from. Some logs do collect those, some don't. I haven't actually, I'd say the higher percentage that I see don't actually have referrer in, so it's quite a good one to configure. And like I said, they're not the default, but they kind of look a little bit like this. So you can see there's extra stuff in there now. You've got the referrer in there, you've got the user agent, and that's kind of how this, again, an Apache configuration basic for a combined log. So these are the kind of logs that we want to shoot for. And a couple of different types that I want to talk about. So one is rotational logs. So this is essentially just how often you want your log to rotate and store a file on the server. So you can rotate it, in this example, every 24 hours. For anyone interested, it's 86,400 seconds, as I've been educated on recently. But this will basically create a log every 24 hours, drop it onto the server, and then it'll just rotate at that sort of frequency. You can set it to whatever frequency you want, really, whatever suits you best and how you want to analyze them. But again, quite a nice thing to have. There's also conditional logs as well, very rarely used because it's quite a niche thing and a niche application, but you can also set up logs to collect certain types of data. So you can have it exclude a certain IP address, for example, if you wanted to exclude a certain internal IP or something like that, or you could get it to exclude a subfolder. In the example here, it's the robots file, but obviously we probably don't want that to be excluded. But you can set all this to try and refine what you get out of a log file to make sure there's no irrelevant information in there. It kind of makes analysis quicker in some cases, but I prefer it to get all these sort of things raw because then you can filter things out as and when you want to. So that is configuring logs. We're going to talk about some issues now, and I'm talking about more issues in obtaining them more than anything because we'll touch on some issues with analysis afterwards. Biggest thing is file size. There's no pun there, I think. But the logs are massive, and it makes exporting them quite a big issue because if you leave them to collect data, I mean, they're just text files. But if you leave them to collect data and leave them unchecked, they can be gigabytes worth of data. So it can make exporting them a bit of an issue. There's quite a few ways around this. One that we can use sometimes at Clicky is splitting them into sort of manageable chunks. So this is a really basic bash script. There's a couple of bash scripts I've got in this talk. They would need to be configured specifically for different types of servers, but the ones that I've got kind of work for us, but they would just need a bit of tweaking if you're going to use them anywhere else. But this one splits log files into 200 megabyte chunks, so it just downloads 200 megabyte at a time, and the output, it's quite messy there, but something like this. So it would just append AA, AB, AC to each file, and like you can see, they're about 200 megabytes-ish in size, which means that you can just drop into those files rather than having to load them all into a tool or load them all into whatever you use to analyze your logs. So that's quite a useful thing to know. One of the most common issues, though, that I come across is security. So I work with quite a few different types of organizations, a lot of which are security conscious. Logs also obviously contain IP addresses, which might make them quite tricky to share. If you've got a really security conscious team, they might not feel comfortable sharing IP addresses with a third party, which obviously is a challenge when you want to try and analyze these logs. But you can ask for them without an IP address. It is possible to analyze logs without an IP address. The challenge that you face with this really is that the IP address allows you to verify bots a lot of the time. So, for example, I'm an SEO, we've got a lot of SEOs in the room. You could crawl a site as Googlebot, and your IP address would then be logged as well, but you'd be able to filter yourself out as Googlebot and verify that you're not Googlebot with that IP address. If you don't have that, then you can't verify that at all. So it is quite a useful thing to have, but you can ask for them without, and you can still do quite a lot of analysis without that IP address, but it's worth noting. The other thing is IPS usage. So anyone know what an IPS is? Anyone? Show of hands? No? Cool, a couple of people. For anyone that's not aware, it's an intrusion prevention system, and I'm going to be basic on this because I'm not going to profess to be a complete security expert. But a typical request from a browser to a server might look something like this. So browser requests information from the server then returns that information based on the request. The way that an IPS comes in is it sits in between the server and the browser, and it's a security measure. It's to make sure that the traffic is legitimate, that it's not trying to overload the server, and it gives you quite a lot of protection from that perspective because you've got a proxy in between. So the browser would request the IPS would then request the data from the server, and it filters back from there, which is brilliant from a security perspective, but it causes a lot of problems because I mentioned IP addresses a minute ago, but if everything comes through your IPS, the IP address for your logs is going to be from your IPS. So it's worth noting that because a lot of IPS providers as well, I've worked with a couple of different ones, they do have folders that you can drop into on their particular environment that you can just take the logs out of. So it's worth noting if you're using an IPS, don't take the logs from your server, take it from your IPS. So onto the analysis piece now. First up is how to know when to analyze logs. So a lot of people will have different ways of doing this. We have two ways of doing it at Clicky that makes it quite easy and automates it. The first one is at preset intervals. So if you're a technical SEO, you might want to factor log file analysis into your monthly workflow, so you might want to get them on a monthly basis. So for example, I'd mentioned the bash script I was going to be talking about. This is one of them. This particular bash script for us, it looks, and this is set up for 24 hours as an example, but it will take log files every 24 hours. It will send those log files to an email address that we specified, so SEOteam@domain.com. And once that's done, the really cool thing about this is that it removes it from the server straight after, so it saves the file space, which is brilliant, and the team get the file that they need, and they don't need to bother developers. Developers are happy because they're not getting loads of questions all the time as well. So this is one way that you can do it. It's those preset intervals, set it to monthly maybe, or every few weeks, depending on your needs and the size of your site. You can also do it for anomalous activity. So if you have a spike of 404s or 500s or any type of response that maybe is a bit odd to you, you can set your logs up, or you can set this script up to then pull logs based on a spike in 404s or 500 errors, for example, which is quite useful because it means that you don't constantly have to be checking them, and you know when an issue has occurred, you will get sent a copy of those logs. So that, again, this is just set up to see a spike of 404s and then send it to SEOteam@domain.com or send a certain amount of logs to that email address. Again, really useful. It means that you can be just you can keep this in the background and you can know that things are taken care of and have a bit of peace of mind there. So we've talked about configuring logs and a couple of ways to get them and a couple of issues that you might face. But when you get them, they look like this. This is a real log file. I've kind of had to replace the domain, but it's quite messy. There's a lot there. Like I said, it's a simple text file. It's not really formatted. So you have to use a tool, really, or I would recommend it. It saves you a lot of time, energy, and effort. You could spend hours and hours and hours trying to format these logs and trying to get them into the right environment. Really, just use a tool. this is my tool of choice. This is Screaming Frog's log file analyzer, probably one of my favorite tools that I use. Don't feel like it gets enough love either. But this allows you to you can just drop a log in here. It can be in a variety of different formats. And what it does is it just pipes it into this, and you get visuals pretty quickly. So you've got things like response codes, events, and URLs here. There's loads of different tabs you can see on the top. It just gives you some really easy ways to cut the data, visualize it, and make things really fast for yourself. So I'd recommend using it. I think it's £99 plus VAT a year, so it's nothing expensive either. So once you've got those logs, you've got them into your tool, let's talk about how to analyze them. So I've kind of broken this down into two sections. We've got maintenance and strategy. Maintenance being fixing things, and strategy being a bit more proactive. So maintenance. The easiest entry-level sort of way into log files is to look at response codes. So obviously in logs, a lot of the data that can be collected is one of them is response codes. So you can see things like 404s, you can find them, redirect them. You can actually see which are being crawled and which are being accessed by users, and get those pages redirected as soon as possible. Really, really simple way. Quite an interesting one as well is to spot inconsistent response codes. So what Screaming Frog's log file analyzer allows you to do is spot URLs that maybe returned a certain response code at one point and then returned another one slightly later on. So again, you can start to look at what the issues might be there in terms of why it's returning different response codes. You can also look at that by user agent as well, which I find really useful. So it could be that a user is getting a 200 and Googlebot, for example, is getting a 403 or something similar to that. And then you can start to work out why and start to troubleshoot that. So it's a nice little way to analyze that. A more niche application of looking at response codes in log files is 304 issues. Everyone aware of what a 304 is? Yeah? Any hands? Anyone? Yeah, cool. For anyone that's not aware of what a 304 is, basically a 304 tells the user agent making a request to a server that they already have a valid representation of a file, so to treat it as a 200 response and to use the cached version of that page or file that they've requested. So it's quite a good way of reducing server load and keeping things moving pretty quickly. But it can backfire. Gary put this on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, which was quite timely. I feel like he knew that this was going to happen. But this is a really niche way that 304s can impact your site. So for example, crawler could come to your site and get a 200, but there might not be any content on the page. And then they might treat it as a soft 404, they might reschedule the crawl, and then they might come back and get a 304 because they've got a cached representation of the page, and it might be that you've got a page that has been crawled by Google that has been told that it hasn't changed and it's got no content on. The other thing that can happen is you might have a page that returns a 304 consistently when there's actually been changes to it. I've run across that a few times, so it's worth noting when you make a change to a page and then checking what the next response code to Googlebot or a similar user agent is to make sure that it isn't a 304 because it's clearly changed and they need a new representation of it. So quite a niche one to try and tackle. You can also do things like spot loading issues. So spot slow loading pages. Like I said, you can get an average response time from each event, get an average bytes that have been downloaded, so you can start to see which pages are responding slowly. If it's correlated to average bytes, it means it's probably quite a large page and that you need to trim that down, but it could be a server error. So it gives you a bit of insight there. A big section of this is going to be talking about Google Search Console errors. Everyone, I assume, has run into this at some point, seen this error in their Search Console and reacted something like this, or at least I do. So this particular error, it means that the page was crawled by Google, not indexed. It might be indexed in the future, no need to do anything with it. Basically, there's not a lot you can do. But there are a few things that you can use logs for to try and analyze this a little bit further and see if you can get the URL crawled. So one thing to look at is if you're linking to the page enough. So what Screaming Frog's log file analyzer allows you to do is put log files and crawl data together as one, and then you can start to see if they've got inlinks and outlinks to certain pages, and you can cross-reference how many times a page has been crawled with how many links it's got, and then you can start to dive into that a little bit more. So you can have things like referring domains and trust flow and unique inlinks, depth, impressions, and events. So there's lots of different things that you can cross-reference here, so you can see if your page hasn't been indexed but it's been crawled, maybe because it's not being seen as important, why that might be the case. And then we have discovered, currently not indexed, another fun error from Google Search Console. So this one means that the page was found by Google, but it wasn't crawled. Google wants to crawl it, but they might overload the site, so they've rescheduled it and they'll come back later. And the crawl date's empty on the report that you'll see in Search Console as well. I think the thing to mention on this is it's more common than you might think. So I got a live example that we had a few weeks ago where a client was on really cheap hosting and a lot of their site wasn't crawled at all, and it was because of this. We switched hosting fairly recently. We've seen a big spike of events, so quite an easy way to tackle that one. You can also do things like pinpoint crawler issues, so you can see details by crawler. You can analyze crawls by depth as well, which is quite useful. So you can see crawl inconsistencies by depth and start looking at where Googlebot and other user agents are spending a lot of their time. Is it at the right depth of your site? Are they getting lost? Are they not getting past a certain point? I mentioned as well that Screaming Frog allows you to see discrepancies between crawls and logs. So this is probably a really easily accessible feature that is quite powerful. So like I said, you can pull crawl data from a crawl that you've done of a site into the log file analyzer to look at aside log file data. And then you can do this really simple filter, which is a URL not in URL data, but in the log file? Or is it in the log file and not in the URL data? But this gives you an idea to say, is a URL being crawled by your crawler, for example, but it isn't being touched by a user agent, and why? What's the issue? Is it not being linked to properly? Does it not have an important level of importance in the site that makes it crawlable? All this sort of stuff is analyzable from that. And then we have, again, another Google Search Console error. So duplicate, Google chose different canonical than user. Again, very frustrating. So something you can do is you can start to check the crawl frequency of canonical versus non-canonical URLs to see if there are consistencies there. So if Google is choosing a different canonical, is it because, are they crawling that more often? So you can start to look at that here. So this is an example of how that might look. So events for a canonical URL versus a non-canonical URL. And then you can start to diagnose that a little bit more. So is it because of internal links? Is it because of referring domains? Is it because of URL importance at parent page level, which we'll go through in a second as well? You can use it to spot log files to spot crawl traps. So this is an example of a site that's running on WordPress. It's using a calendar plugin. The site itself is about 50 pages. It's not massive. But it's got an events calendar, and this creates infinite URLs, and it's not regulated at all. There's nothing in the robots file. There's no directives on any of these pages to say, don't touch these. It can go forever. I've seen this crawler get stuck quite a bit on this. So you can start to see this in log file data as well, see if crawlers are spending a lot of time here, because if they're spending a lot of time on these types of URLs, they're probably not spending enough time on the important pages of your site, and therefore you need to be able to regulate that. Something else you can do if anyone works with PPC teams, bit of love for your PPC team here, is you can start to help them with issues they might get in the ads platform with log files as well. So again, an example that we had, you can see the date on that, it's July this year, it's very, very recent. But we had an issue where we had a destination not working error from Google Ads, and they just said they were unable to crawl it. All of us were testing on our laptops, on our phones. We could get to these pages. They were absolutely fine. There was nothing wrong with them. And then we checked the logs, and we realized that Googlebot was being blocked from accessing the robots file, and therefore it wasn't getting any further into the site, which is something we fixed. And then, lo and behold, the destination not working error just went away. So this sort of thing can help you to diagnose these issues really, really quickly and just get them fixed. So that's some of the maintenance issues and some of the things that you can do from that perspective. I'm going to touch a couple of strategy things now. So the first one is benchmarking performance. So you can test the impact of changes that you've made to your site and cross-reference with crawl behavior, which is quite useful because you can start to get an insight into whether they've worked or not. Because you might make a change and you might not see anything in terms of traffic or visibility for a little while, but you might see some early signs from crawl behavior, and it can validate some of the changes that you've made. An example here is a blog that we managed on a wedding venue site. It had pagination, and then we switched it to infinite scroll, and all of the visibility and traffic for those pages dropped off. So we switched it back to pagination. Crawl events started to come back, and then visibility, and then traffic. So it gave us an early indication as to what we'd done was correct, and it helped to validate the decision and time spent on development. Cool. So the next one is determining URL importance. This is a screenshot taken from one of Google's patents on their URL scheduler. The URL scheduler, essentially, to break it down really, really simply, will crawl pages that it deems to be more important in your site more often. I'll link to the actual patent itself if you're interested in a tweet after this. But this is a really interesting quote from Gary as well on page importance. So he says that higher quality sections in a site get crawled more, they get crawled deeper. So if you have a parent page that's really important, you might actually see that the children of that parent page get crawled a lot more as well. So just to go back to that non-canonical issue, if you've got a parent non-canonical page that's being seen as more important, it might not be that the in the child pages are being linked to more, but it might be that they're seen as important because of the parent they're attached to. So always certain things like this can affect your crawling of your site, so worth bearing in mind. But you can use URL importance to speed up new page discovery as well. So if you know what the most important pages on your site are, the ones that are crawled the most frequently, you can use that to help get pages crawled pretty quickly. So you can utilize internal linking from frequently crawled pages and high importance pages as dictated by that number of crawl events. And then a little note on importance as well from Dawn Anderson on migrations pretty much. So if you have a lot of unimportant URLs on your site and you're undergoing a migration, you might wait a little bit of time to get those unimportant URLs moved over because they're not seen as a priority. So if you're about to undergo a migration, I would always recommend analysing logs to see how many unimportant pages you have in terms of how many crawl events they get on a regular basis. And you might want to either look at removing those if they're not important, if they're not relevant anymore, or looking at ways you can make them feel more important to crawlers as well. The final one that I've got to talk to you about is query counts, a bit of a nice way to analyse performance based on logs as well. So for anyone that's not aware of what a query count is, it's basically the amount of queries that a page or a section of a site is associated with, and you can get that information from Search Console. I use Search Analytics for Sheets, which is on screen right now. But you can start to look at how many queries a page is associated with and cross-reference that with how many crawl events that it has. And what I've seen over the last 6 to 12 months is that almost like an increase in crawl events tied to an increase in query counts. And then that's a good indicator, again, as to organic performance and the increase in organic performance there as well, or at least validating some of the optimization work that you've done. So I've gone through a lot there. I've run over time a little bit, I think, as well. But the slides are available from this link afterwards on the Clicky site. Please take a look through them. If you've got any questions, come and grab me afterwards. But yeah, that's me. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
Monthly reporting making you want to shove sharp things up your nose? Try Dragon Metrics, the all-in-one SEO software with mind-blowing reporting tools.